The next topic is about the specifications of the files. And this is the thing which we'll try and avoid the technical stuff, and we'll just try and make you understand when you get to that export window, both with individual files and with the stereo files, there are some differences between them, what to look out for, and when you get all those drop-down menus, basically not to freak out.
Yeah.
So when you're exporting stuff to send to mixing, how would you sort of expect people to set that?
In terms of the kind of output settings that you would get from most DAWs, a lot of the time what they'll ask you is they might ask you the timeline space that you want to export. So sometimes, like, you've got to be careful. Sometimes if you've just been looping a section to work on or something, or you've got locators set at certain points in your DAW, that might not, you might not have it on a loop, so you might not hear it looping or anything like that. But sometimes when you come to bounce out the audio or export it, it'll use those locators. So check that it's set to export the whole track. Most DAWs will have an option like that where you're telling it not to do a specific sort of region. You can do if you're completely happy that you've set those locators correctly, but by all means, if there's some plug-in reverb tail that sort of goes on for 3 minutes afterwards or whatever, I'd rather have it and I can trim that back than for it to cut off somewhere. So making sure the locators are set correctly or that you have no locators set is important. And then we get into the actual specifications of the audio file, which usually it's going to give you a few options. One will be perhaps about bit depth. The other one will be about sample rate. And then maybe there will be another option about normalizing. I know that Ableton, for instance, has just a checkbox that you can say normalize the output file and things like that.
Yeah, there's also the I don't know what it's called now, but it used to be called acidizing.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Where you can put other data in the file to do with where it fits on a timeline in certain DAWs. You've got to be really careful with that, because sometimes you can drop something into a session that already has stuff in. For example, say you've done a bit of vocals at home to add to your session that you've already got in the studio. It will then try and stretch the file to the grid in the other piece of software. So the best thing to do is, if there's something you don't know what it is, I would take it off. Because some DAWs often try and add sort of proprietary metadata and
Ableton
and stuff.
is one for that. I immediately, whenever I install Ableton again, I go in and just change that setting that makes it make all these analysis files along with the audio, because I don't need those.
I think generally the one that you find is that it within the WAV it includes the tempo. And bearing in mind that, I mean, maybe not so much in mixing, but in mastering, you're never going to use the tempo. No. You're going to be working in the time, seconds, minutes, hours. So when you drop that in, and I've learnt this the hard way when I first started, Cubase, for example, which is what I used to load audio files into, starts at 120. So files come in, and sometimes the original file is actually 125 BPM. Yeah. So it sounds right. And then you master it and send it back. And it's actually, it's stretched.
Sped up.
So, if in doubt, take it off, I think. And that applies to both.
I can't think of a setting in an output dialogue of a DAW. I can't think of a setting where that rule does not apply. If you don't know what it is and you don't need it, or you don't think you need it, just leave it off.
Maybe it's time to breach the dangerous topic of dither.
Okay.
Okay, right. If you don't know what dither is, it doesn't matter. Basically, when you take a piece of audio that's 1 bit depth and you need to export it another one for a specification, you've been asked to do it at this, or you've produced it at 32-bit and you're going to mix it 24-bit, or you're exporting it for CD audio or CD audio standard, which most of the world is still working at, you apply dither. If there is no change, you don't apply dither. That's basically it.
I mean, the sort of caveat in that, so what dither does is it will get around what is called truncation distortion. The way that you can kind of hear an example, a vicious example of truncation distortion is if you listen to like 8-bit audio.
Yeah.
A lot of the time you can hear quite an obvious level of distortion that's been added to the original musical audio or whatever audio. And if you don't add dither, you will get at the end of like as that last sort of bit of information goes, it will be a very definite kind of fizzing in and out.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like you've got like a really, really fast like gate.
Yeah.
At the very lowest bit
Volumes,
of dynamic
yeah.
that it can deal with. So you get this sort of like chattering sound. And although you can't necessarily hear the difference in like big blocks of sound where you've got lots going on, it can completely destroy like a reverb tail or a fade. It will change the shape of it because there'll be certain bits that don't exist, which were in the original audio. What dither does is basically puts randomized noise in that area so that it never drops off.
Yeah. And normally we feel a bit panicky when the idea of adding noise to our signal feels a little anathema to what we're trying to do as engineers, is keep things clean and, well, in some cases. But basically the level of this noise will be so low. Yeah. I mean, by all means, try it. Find a dither plugin, put it on a track, make sure you've got nothing else playing, but crank your speakers, listen to see if you can hear it. It will be, you will not notice dither on a track. But with the kind of, especially with mixing, the accumulative effect of lots of truncation distortion and these sort of problems adding up can be something that can really ruin the sound.
Yeah, and you've got to bear in mind that a missing bit is not something which sort of just tails and has a sort of weird noise and the stuff. It's like an absolute stop.
Yeah.
And an absolute stop is kind of like a square wave. It gives you that, or like when you've clipped something, it gives you like an absolute like sound. Yeah. And that would happen. Imagine lots of those happening as your fade goes down. That's what truncation basically sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a nice rule of sort of digital audio. Digital audio, if it's going at a very sudden angle, will often sound harsh and be a distortion. When we talk about things like square waves on synthesizers, they're not completely square because sound dropping to nothing in no time at all is a physical impossibility. Yeah. But they sound harsher and things. So we want to try and avoid that with our audio, especially when we're mixing lots of tracks. If that's happening all over the place, then it's a problem.
And also as well, like the gain's being boosted, so you might not hear it. I think it's a problem when it's not compressed or whatever, but then maybe in the mastering stage it's got quite a bit hotter, or you've added some EQ. Some of those things which didn't feel like a problem to begin with now become a problem. Yeah. Also, it's literally the easiest thing in the entire world.
Yeah, the main good thing is don't worry.
Don't worry. It's basically, if you want to, you can ignore all that conversation and go back to the first thing, which was if you're changing the bit depth to something lower, you dither. Yeah.
The only little caveat that I'd talk about with dither is that a lot of the time, so basically, if you are exporting out of your DAW, there are sort of usually there'll be 2 or 3 options usually. You might have some really low, you might have the option to export 8-bit or something like that, but most of them will be talking about 16-bit or 24-bit. However, internally, a lot of DAWs work at higher bit rates, so like 32-bit floating point, or 64-bit. Bit depth. Sorry, not sample rate. So a lot of the time, although you might be, recording at 24-bit, and then you are also exporting at 24-bit, it can often be a good idea to put dither on anyway, even though you're going out at the same bit depth, because internally your DAW is working at a higher bit rate. There's a little bit of kind of like
bit depth.
Sorry, bit depth. I'm terrible.
You can tell I'm a mastering engineer.
Yeah. So I mean, I think a fair sort of thing would be, if in doubt, dither, because the amount of noise that you're actually adding to something is going to be so small.
Also, DAWs are becoming a lot more transparent about these things, and it's becoming a lot easier to know when to do it.
Yeah.
Moving on, the other thing that you can move on the drop-down menu is sample rate.
Sample depth.
Sample depth.
Sample rate.
Now, this is whatever you do, don't Google it, because you're probably going to have a really intense experience that you're never going to recover from.
Yeah.
Without going into the details of how digital audio works, basically, the bit depth is the amount of values you can have. The sample rate is how often it samples them, and that's how it puts together that,
Waveform.
The waveform thing. It looks like a staircase, which isn't a staircase.
Yes.
If you look closely on your software. Now, this is where it gets slightly confusing, because at one end you've got the audio product, and that will have to exist in certain sample rates and bit depths, which is still most times CD audio standard 44.1 16-bit. But it might be that you've got stuff going on, samples, recordings, all sorts within your session at different sample rates. So the rule of thumb is that when you're doing your stuff, you're mixing, you're producing, your session will run at a sample rate. Mm-hmm. It will produce all the audio that's playing out of your session at a sample rate. And that will be somewhere. It's usually when you set it up, but also on some programs you'll see it in the top. It will give you like the sort of the diagnostics about the session, etc. What you really need to do, unless you have a specific thing where you're exporting it for, say, for example, you've done it at 44.1, but you're doing an export for, say, like a piece of video broadcast stuff, where you've been asked specifically to change the sample rate because they need to just drop it in.
Yeah.
Or you've got something which you're going to then re-release as like a 96K file, export it at that. Mm-hmm. Don't change it to anything else for any other reason. If you have an inkling that it might make it better quality or whatever, just don't do it.
Yeah.
Because there's all sorts of problems that can come with that later down the line. And if you've got it all going at 44.1 or 48, which a lot of people work at, if you then export it at like 96, for example, or 82, what you're actually doing is adding loads to the file size, potentially adding problems for the next person who's dropping it in. Mm-hmm. And all they're going to have to do is potentially either change all their settings to that to then work on it, even though it's actually, the actual audio itself is still 44.1 or 48 or whatever. And you have to then apply another process of sample rate conversion.
Yeah.
Which isn't like, you don't get off scot-free with sample rate conversion. It is a process. It does have its own artifacts and it changes. And you really don't want to have like unknown changes at any point in this process. So export it at whatever your session is working at. And also don't feel the need to change your session up to something else or down to something else. Let the engineers, the audio professionals deal with that, because we've got the tools and the analysis, and we can look into that in programs like RX and stuff. So we can diagnose anything that we think isn't quite right.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about exporting what the session as you've recorded it, in the same sample rate that you've recorded it, because as you say, it does bring out a lot of problems. And if you go looking online for people talking about the resolution of audio files and things like that, it's very misleading, because they generally tend to refer it and try and relate it to like image resolution or something like that. So there's sort of, the argument is often, well, 4K looks better than HD and things like that. Audio does not work in the same way. When you see those diagrams of little stepped kind of representations of audio files, and they say, well, these are the samples, the 44.1 thousand times a second samples or whatever, look, they're little steps. The thing is, as soon as you turn them into a waveform in the real world, they turn into a smooth line anyway. Again, we go back to this idea of audio cannot suddenly be from 0 and then up to a volume in no time at all. It's a physical impossibility. So it does convert it back into a smooth wave.
Perhaps we'll do another video on digital audio debunking.
Yeah. In the meantime, we'll just put up a very quick little thing here that sort of shows the step wave and then what it actually comes out as.
The key there is to remember that when you look at a waveform on a computer, you're looking at the storage. You're not looking at the representation of the waveform.
Yeah, this isn't how it comes out. Yeah. This is what it's like in the computer.
This is what it's stored like in the computer. Yeah. So the last thing to wrap up that topic is the actual file type that you export.
Yep.
And most DAWs now give you quite a lot of options. And the trick here is to always export a .wav, a WAV file, or a .aiff, which is basically a Apple WAV file that's sort of used, but not often that used anymore.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think most musicians or sort of people on the non-professional side of it can think about those as being the same thing.
Yeah.
In terms of they're both lossless audio.
PCM
files.
audio.
Yeah, PCM audio, so that basically means that it is not changing the audio at all.
Mm-hmm. It's just the way that the computer stores it, and when it's communicated. But then all DAWs just see them as the same thing anyway.
Yeah,
so
completely.
That doesn't make a difference. But never, never, never export an MP3.
No. Or AAC from GarageBand.
Yes, yeah. So some of them will, especially with like demoing software and stuff, they will give you that option because they assume that you're just going to then, like GarageBand, for example, assumes that you're just making something to then whack on your phone or
SoundCloud
something,
or
put up online.
Completely.
So you need to just check that. Basically, if it comes up with a screen that says how many kilobytes per second you want, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Because that's talking about data compression.
Yeah. The only options that I think you want to have are the bit depth and sample rate that we talked about earlier in terms of the actual, numbers settings of an audio file.
Yeah.